I'd like to welcome you to our webinar series, Collaboration for Systems Change, and this is in conversation with the Australian Global Health Alliance, and I've got some really exciting speakers to introduce you to in a moment. My name's Nick Vogelpol. I'm from Day 4 Projects, and I will be your host for today. And before we get any further, I'd like to acknowledge country. I'm joining you from beautiful Wurundjeri country here in Naarm. It's an amazing rainy day, and there's a smell of change in the air, and green and red earth kind of popping up everywhere. So I'm really privileged and honoured to work and play on these lands. And I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders, the Wurundjeri elders, past, present, and future. Acknowledge that we're joining from many Aboriginal lands today, and you're all very welcome. Special acknowledgement to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues and friends with us today. Thank you very much for your time, and we're really pleased to have you here. A little bit about us before we start, depending on how you came about learning about this webinar series. We're a consultancy based in Melbourne called Day 4 Projects, and we specialise in collaboration, all things partnerships. And in the spirit of good collaboration, it's always really important to think about the voices that we have in the room and the diversity and multiplicity of perspectives that we can bring to conversations. And this one is about health equity, about global health. And we acknowledge that there are voices present today that are part of this conversation, and there are voices that are absent from this conversation. And so we won't speak on behalf of anyone, but know that this is an ongoing conversation, and there's many people to be part of it. We work with all sorts of different partners, working in partnership with one another from all different kinds of sectors and jurisdictions. And we work on complex challenges together, where we kind of know that working together is the way that we might be able to affect some change. So yeah, that's a bit about us. This is kind of the map for today. Don't worry, we're already through most of it. I was going to give you a bit of a welcome and an overview. Hopefully I've done that. Do get in touch if you want to know anything about this series. We've run some with some really interesting partnerships in the past. I'll introduce you to speakers, and we'll just have a really kind of open, frank, and hopefully interesting conversation with some panelists I have here today. And there's opportunities for questions from the audience. So if you do have questions, you can use the Q&A function or the chat, and we will get to them as we go through today's session. Just a little bit about this webinar series itself. So as I said, we work with all sorts of different partnerships and collaborative initiatives, and people were telling us that they'd like to know more about, okay, what actually happens beyond the theory of collaboration in these partnerships. And so we've kind of designed a bi-monthly online, we have done it bi-monthly actually, but we do a bi-monthly session where we bring together folks who are working in collaboration with one another to talk about some of the things that that are working for them and some of the things that they're doing. It's usually a pretty informal discussion, conversation, questions, and so that's sort of the layout of it. I'm always interested in other models, so if you've seen something better, do get in touch and let us know. I'm going to stop sharing my slides because I think it's nice to see faces instead. And I'm going to introduce my panelists to you today. On the call with us is Selena Lowe, who's the Executive Director of the Australian Global Health Alliance, Helen Evans, who is one of our executive committee members of the Global Health Alliance. We have Nick Chuckman from Policy Cures Research, he's the CEO there, and Anushka Patel, who's the Chief Scientist at the George Institute for Global Health. So a really exciting group of people. Well, I'm excited by them. I hope you all are too. I'm going to kick us off with a question, and I'm going to just talk a little bit about the Australian Global Health Alliance. I'm going to ask Selena and Helen to tell us a bit about where it started, where it's going, and what are some of the things that the Australian Global Health Alliance aims to do. So over to you.
Thanks, Nick. I'll kick off and then I'll hand over to Selena. I mean, this was an initiative that was driven by Ian Anderson, who was at that time the Pro-Vice Chancellor Engagement at University of Melbourne, and Leslie Podesta, who was the Global Advocacy Managing Director at the Fred Hollows Foundation. And they were inspired by the Washington Global Health Alliance, that's Washington, Seattle, where about 8 years before, they'd looked in Seattle and thought, you know, we've got the most amazing collection of global health expertise through from, you know, universities, research institutes, international NGOs, foundations, not the least of which was the Gates, but there are other foundations, and biotech industry. And we actually don't ever talk to each other. And the world is changing really rapidly. Why don't we just try and link up and get a better outcome? So Ian and Leslie were aware of that, and they were keen to see if we could do that in Melbourne. Actually, initially, Ian's view was he called it the Carlton campus. And I'd just come back, this was late 2014, I'd just come back from 10 years based in Geneva, and they asked me whether I'd do a bit of exploratory discussion to see whether people were interested. It wasn't really worth progressing it if people weren't interested. And I talked to a lot of CEOs and heads of departments at universities, etc. And there was an interest, a cautious interest. People said, we do agree that we don't talk to people, and it'd really be good. We bump into people in the country and work out that they're doing things that overlap with us, etc. But we don't want something that's just a talk fest. Anyway, it evolved from there. We had a round table that the City of Melbourne hosted, where people said, yes, let's go with it. And we finally launched it in April 2017. So, you know, it was about 18 months in the development, because these things don't move fast. And there's also a question of most of the work being done was voluntary at that stage. And the aim was really to foster collaboration to improve health outcomes. And we decided it should focus significantly on the Asia Pacific region. And in that early model, we had 3 goals. The first one was to mobilize, which was bringing together organizations and institutions to increase the visibility of what we're doing. I mean, one of the things that had been clear to me in Geneva, but also, you know, I remember Vivian Lin from the WIPRA office saying, we've got all this expertise in Australia, but actually why do the big institutions and organizations, global ones, always look to Europe or the US? We need to be more visible. And maybe it's because we're smaller, but so increase the visibility of what we had to offer, and also to raise awareness of the global health sector. Second one was to cultivate, that was innovative partnerships. And we had a strong focus then on Indigenous organizations who are often really not very connected to the global health scene, and yet there's huge lessons to be learned both ways, and to strengthen capabilities. So that was how we kicked off. We moved from being the Carlton campus, and I said, that's not going to work. It needs to be Melbourne, Victoria. And then in 2018, we decided actually it needed to be Australia. And we did all of this pretty much on the smell of an oily rag. I saw that Misha Coleman's LinkedIn. She was our initial executive director on 2 or 3 days a week. And then Selena's taken over, and I'm going to hand across to Selena. So it's evolved. I'll hand across to Selena to say where we're at now, what we're doing, what we're focusing on.
Thanks very much, Helen. So jump to 6 years later, it's 2022. It's a very different global health environment, even in a few 6 short years, both in terms of new global health actors, but also in terms of the expertise, capability, and also awareness, you know, of the skill set within Australia. We exist primarily to support the global health institutions and organisations in Australia, and we're a representative body of members. Now in 2022, since the beginning, we also host 2 secretariats. Secretariat of the WHO Collaborating Centre Network, of which there are 53 in this country. There are 800 globally. So it's quite telling that 53 centres of global excellence in health, in global health, are placed here. And we also host the Pacific Friends of Global Health, which is a tripartite collaboration of Gavi Vaccine Alliance, the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, Malaria, and Unitate. And the Secretariat and the Advisory Board and the Executive last year, before I started, underwent a strategic review. That strategic review identified 2 key objectives in terms of strategic themes that the group would like to work on together as an alliance of members rather than individually and have the Alliance focus on. And they were growth, obviously, growth of our network and reach, climate change and health security, and gender equality. And I came in around that time and started to ask the questions of why growth and how would we be able to do this. Certainly, the Australian the global health ecosystem is not too dissimilar, but is dissimilar to other OECD type alliances, such as in Northern America, Canada, USA, and also Europe. Different in the sense that although we have very similar punch above our weight technical skill set and expertise, we don't have the plethora of global health philanthropies such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We don't have Bloomberg's, we don't even have a Wellcome Trust. We do have really supportive government mechanisms that exist, but by and large, they don't cover the survival and thriving for many of these wonderful, I call them common good for health, global health institutions that contribute greatly, both historically in the last 20 years. You look at tobacco control, the HIV movement and technical expertise, to many other range of inputs such as NCDs and also maternal and child health. So we have now developed an umbrella strategy, which is not yet on our website, but primarily focused on 3 pillars of growth, which will continue to advocate for climate change and health security and also gender equality, but also integrate and bring back some of the original thoughts for the founders, such as Helen and Ian and others, in how the Alliance was hoping to grow and continue to be relevant. So the first pillar is global health globally. While many of the institutions have their own networks and we have our own networks too, we want to be able to integrate all of these in a more systemic and sharing fashion to see where we can help each other and where we can best connect. And the kind of outputs right now that we're working on together in this field are working with Day 4 Projects, in fact, to make the very first the inaugural Australian Global Health Landscape analysis. And we hope to launch that report early next year, or perhaps if some of the findings at the end of this year, we'll be able to share them. And continue to work at conferences and joint thematic works through webinars with members themselves or our own branded series. We have a developed annual congress that's emerging. At the end of this year, last year it was themed Global Health Leadership with Right Honorary Helen Clark, former Prime Minister of New Zealand, who fronted very actively, obviously, on global health leadership with her history. And this year we're going to theme it around global health diplomacy for reasons we can explain in the discussion if you want to. Our second pillar of growth is slightly different, both in terms of what we've seen in other alliances in so-called North. And we're going to focus on global health in our space. A lot of younger people entering in global health often think about global health as stuff that we do over there in the Indo-Pacific, in Asia-Pacific, in Africa, and not recognizing and investing and resourcing the kind of global health equity challenges that are really relevant, to our backyard and in the world around us very closely. So we have been working with some of our First Nations academies, led by Professor Ian Anderson, and together with a group of global health scholars interested in decolonisation of global health, which is currently a dialogue happening globally, looking at ways that we can integrate our relevancy in this field as a unique Australian alliance and see where we can help each other, both in terms of being able to promote and advance Indigenous justice and health equity, and at the same time promote First Nations global health, and also formulate an identity that is not just about our work overseas, but also sharing our work locally. And in that second pillar of global health in our space, we're also looking at, we hope to be looking further at workforce capacity. This has been, it comes up again and again in conversations that we have in dialogue. Both our WHO network colleagues and Pacific Friends colleagues and all of the global health institutions we talk to regularly talk about this. They do intense and fantastic research, health systems research and other in this area. We want to be continuing a commitment in the long term here. So how do we do all this? We have brilliant institutions and CEOs, such as you see on this panel. We're sometimes linked, we're sometimes not. We have to do better at this. But there are certain platforms that don't yet exist, at least not in this country, that perhaps we can work on together better and see if we can promote and use to create a better exchange and sharing of our knowledge and learnings. So the first one is that we work in partnership with government. We have a good relationship with our state government partners and Department of Foreign Affairs and trade partners, but we're also working with new and old MPs around hopefully a new entity in Parliament, which will be a Friends of Global Health. Secondly, we will start work next year looking at sustaining financing in global health beyond our usual partners and traditional suspects, and look at the mechanisms that exist already, see how far we can push this envelope further, and see how best to define this in this kind of changing global health landscape to integrate all of our partners beyond health towards our interests. And that includes private sector work. And then finally, because global health is often the realm and the expertise of really expert partners, most of us coming from a health background, but we need both funding support and political allyship from outside the health world. We want to be able to talk about global health in the same way that we brand other commodities. And we've launched a program which is more integrating the social and the arts communities into our work of global health. And we started this year with our inaugural film festival. It was, by all reports, a success for those involved, and we hope to continue that next year. So this is us in terms of where we are. I'm only speaking very abstractly in terms of the framework. And I guess the challenge is really how how relevant these platforms will be to the global health community as we use and continue, and to just continue to have like spaces and different creative opportunities to gather and share and then progress on the themes that matter. I'll stop there and hand back to you.
Thanks, Selena. It's great to hear all the different things that the Alliance are working on, and I know that we've got members joining us today who are part of those efforts as well. Anushka, I wonder if I can turn to you for a question. And we've just been speaking about challenges in this region, and I'm kind of interested from your perspective what some of those challenges might mean for global health in this region, in Australia.
Thanks very much, Nick. And maybe in answering that, I should position my organisation. I won't position myself because that will take forever, but my organisation at least in the conversation, because of course perspective is really important when we think about what the challenges are from an Australian context. So the George Institute, our origins are very much in Australia, and we have a major presence here, and actually we focus on problems, health issues, and addressing inequity in Australia. Like Selena, we focus on a broader definition of global health as, transnational health challenges, global forces that are shaping those that are just as important in this country as elsewhere. But we do consider ourselves a global organization. We have offices and staff also in China, in India, and in the United Kingdom. And at any given time, we engage with partners and activities across 40 to 50 countries across the economic spectrum. And we're fundamentally a research organization, as our name suggests, and we have a particular focus on non-communicable diseases, which 10 years ago people would say, what's that got to do with global health? But no one says that anymore. And we try to create impact through, like other research organizations, advocacy, policy engagement, but also commercial activities. So that gives a sense of the range of partnerships that collaborations that we engage in this country, but also in other countries. So research organizations, governments, community organizations, as well as commercial entities. But we're also thinking about, as an Australian organization, or as an organization that had at its origins in Australia, how do we partner internally, given that we are an organization that had groups of individuals and offices, both in the so-called global north and global south. We articulate our mission, as I said, around a definition of global health that is transnational. And we try to apply an equity lens across everything we do. But inevitably, this draws us into that discourse that Selena was referring to, the decolonization movement, that's seeking to really address those ingrained systems of dominance and power. So we have to think about that internally as well as with our external partners within Australia, but also within each country where we work, as well as between those countries. And that's, of course, going beyond equity, thinking about justice and dignity. So for our part, within our organization, we're just starting on that journey. And it's being shaped primarily by voices, again, reflecting on some comments that Selena made. It's actually being shaped by Indigenous voices, First Nations voices in Australia, but also our colleagues in India and staff within each of our offices that represent the African or the Latin American diaspora. These are the voices that really need to lead the discussion as we embark on that journey. But also, I think it's interesting, and this is the sort of localization part of it. As we've started on these conversations, it's increasingly apparent to us that those same ingrained systems of dominance and power also operate at the local level. And it's not necessarily, for example, in Australia, only relating to First Nations communities. It's a range of marginalized communities where health inequity is an issue. And so they're similar issues, even if they have different historical legacies. And so we're thinking about what is our approach, and we can talk about that obviously further in this conversation.
Thank you, Anushka. It's really, really interesting and important to kind of know the ways in which you're working in this space. And as you say, at the beginning of a journey, and it will be a long one, I'm sure, for all of us working in this sector. I know we've brought together a conversation today around partnerships and the way and some of the ways in which partnerships are working or not working within the global health space. And Nick's sitting here with us today, so I want to invite you into the conversation, Nick, perhaps to talk about some of the emerging trends or the different kinds of models of partnership you see being explored in global health, and perhaps some of the ways they're working or not.
Thanks, Nick. I might take Anushka's lead and just give a bit of context for my organisation, which sort of explains the angle that I've taken in that answer. And my organisation, Policy Cures Research, is a global health-focused research and policy group looking to solve health equity challenges by sort of providing evidence and analysis to policymakers and funders. And our particular focus is on diseases and health issues that affect people without the capacity to pay. And often that means people in low and middle income countries, but also people in disadvantaged communities within high income countries, such as Indigenous communities. And as a result, they don't represent an attractive market to develop new drugs and vaccines. And so these diseases and health issues become neglected from a product development or an R&D perspective. And there is an entrenched disparity in the sort of response and the tools being developed to address these health issues. And so our focus is trying to help redress that imbalance and that inequity. And, you know, it's probably not fair to call emerging something that's maybe now 20 years old, but one of the first things that we saw when people began to recognize that the old model of, governments would fund early and basic research, and companies in the markets would take care of the rest, and that'd get us products, was that partnership was needed to solve this this market failure, really. And so we saw the establishment of, and I'm talking here in sort of global health research, the development of actual discrete public-private partnerships or product development partnerships that brought together the sort of the funding from philanthropic and government funders, the expertise of the private sector to develop new drugs and vaccines, and also the input and advice and ownership to some extent of the communities being affected in developing drugs that actually, or products that took into account the needs and priorities of the community. And so partnerships, these product development partnerships, were a critical mechanism by which this sort of inequities has been addressed. And they've been incredibly successful, I think. They account for a channel probably only less than a fifth of all the global funding that's going in neglected infectious diseases, one of the areas that we look at, but well over half of the products that have been approved over the last couple of decades for these diseases have had the involvement of product development partnerships. One of the things we have seen, though, in recent years is much more investment directly between the governments and the private sector. And that's an interesting trend. And I think it brings some advantages and some disadvantages. And whilst I think there is a search for efficiency and timeliness, particularly in responding to things like COVID, it also, moves away from some of the benefits of that more established partnership model.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Nick. Yeah, it's interesting, as you say, these things take different shapes or forms depending on the context that we're operating in, and there's lots of different factors. I'm interested, Helen, as you listen to Nick there, and I know from your experience you'll have some examples of where collaboration has worked or is working in this space. I'm interested if you would like to comment.
Yes, I mean, building on, I guess, what both Anushka and Nick has said, I mean, a couple of examples. I've worked with both the Global Fund for AIDS, TB and Malaria and Gavi, the Vaccine Allowance, probably the two biggest public-private partnerships. And so just like with PDPs, they were based on the understanding that bilateral donors on their own can't achieve nearly as much as if you bring all the partners together. So it's both capacity and resourcing, because they're both funding organizations, but it's also bringing the different sectors together to develop a much better understanding, which builds across the sectors, I guess, respect and trust, and involves everybody working together. So I think those two partnerships have been extraordinary in what they've achieved. I'm also very aware, and responding to Anushka's comments about the whole much greater understanding of ingrained systems of dominance and power. They are still, those two big organizations are still based in Geneva. They do have around the table, which was, a huge step forward. They have civil society, they have implementing countries, donors, researchers, foundations, etc. But it's, the power dynamics are still there. And I think that I would like to think that one of the good things coming out of the pandemic, and also I think this increased focus on localization and decolonization, is that organizations like Global Fund and Gavi will have to rethink their structures as well. But having said that, I think they're a great start. I think to have civil society sitting at the table was, in many ways, it was really interesting to see the donors, because it was actually a big change for donors, not to sit at the table and say, well, we're providing the money, so this is where we want things to go, or we'll dominate. To have civil society groups push back and say, no, we don't agree with that. So yeah, that was a bit of a change in the power dynamics, but there's a long way to go. So that, I think there are great examples there, but there's still works in progress. And then if I go to within Australia, I mean, I worked with the Office for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health for 7 years, and we provided funding for the Aboriginal community controlled health services. And, they are totally based on local communities making decisions for themselves. And they do know best. And I think while there are challenges there about skills development and capacity, they made a great step forward in terms of First Nations people feeling comfortable to access health services. And quite a lot of the health problems are because First Nations people didn't feel comfortable. They weren't welcome into mainstream medical services, but these were services that had a much more integrated approach, and where they were their place. And for me as a non-Indigenous person managing that program, I just learned a huge amount. I learned about sitting and listening, about the way that decisions were made differently, and things take time, but in the end, they really assist in terms of equitable access to health services. So those are sort of two examples.
Thank you, Helen. I wonder if any of the panelists want to respond. I've got many questions for you, but Anushka.
Thanks, Nick. Helen, I was just going to extend your comments around the influence of some of the major global health fund, the donors, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, etc. And I think in the global health research space, the public funders are also enormously influential, and they're again mostly largely based in high-income country settings. Obviously, there's great push towards greater allocation to funding from within low and middle-income country governments to focus on local priorities. And it's, I think, unavoidable that there's that sort of outsider gaze on local issues from the public funders as well. But I do think there has been a concerted effort by many of the funders, I'd say particularly so in the UK, perhaps less so here in Australia, I think, to try and particularly focus on both how those priorities are developed, but also how the collaborations are shaped and how they fund those. I mean, in the past, and it still is the case in Australia, that you have to have the lead applicant has to be an Australian. Now in the UK, even the NIHR is funding principal investigators who are based in low and middle income countries without a UK, necessarily having a UK partner. Now, of course, there's still encouraging collaborations that have a shared understanding of the complex system problems that are being addressed, and the nature of the technical and other skills that are being brought to the table, shared understanding of really the purpose and the values of that partnership, shared resources and expertise, and effective ways of pooling those between partners that might have those inherent sort of power imbalances, but fundamentally also trying to address those power imbalances. But there's only so much they can do there. They can look at how much funding is going to which partner, who's making the decisions, how is the community engagement happening, but it's always with this outward gaze or outside gaze, and that's a challenge. But I think there are certainly there's recognition, and there are steps being taken to try and address some of those challenges, and of course also having the peer review panels that are often now dominated by researchers from low and middle income countries rather than from those high income country settings. So I think some positive moves in those directions.
Can I, yes, just building on what Anushka was saying, I think we have there are a lot of conflicting pressures about moving it forward. And I think I'm assuming everybody on the panel would be very committed to evidence-based approaches. Also a strong focus on accountability, and then particularly from donors accountability, which I totally, having been a donor myself in various iterations, both with the Australian government and then I guess with Global Fund and Gavi, when you're using taxpayers' money, you have to be extremely mindful of the fact that if it's being seen to be misused or wasted, then that is a huge issue, and the money is not likely to continue to come. On the other hand, it actually it also pressures against innovation and risk. And in many of the lower income countries, you know, there are risks there associated, and finding that balance of localization, handing it across local priorities, balanced with donors' very strong requirement for accountability and managing every dollar, they're conflicting tensions. I don't think there's any answers to it, but it does lead to a lot of tension. I sit on the Global Fund's Independent Evaluation Committee, and it comes up time and time again that while there's a strong commitment to country-driven, it's the risk and the financial risk is dominant in terms of how things are managed, and that particularly works against community groups, community-led activities, because they often have very much more limited capacity to meet all those accountability requirements. So I think that's an area that needs a whole lot of progress on. I'll stop there.
And I think, sorry, Nick, I just jump in. I was just going to say, I mean, I think true partnership involves loss. And in particular, but not limited to loss of control. And that is one of the real tensions, that there's a real difference between saying, oh, sure, we'll have some CSOs on our governing board or our advisory board, versus truly engaging and relinquishing some degree of control over the distribution of funds and the strategic direction, etc. The other thing I just wanted to observe from your comments, Helen, about the fact that you learnt a lot during partnership is that I think that partnership changes the organisations, and this is also something you're talking about the other day. Partnership changes the organisations that are involved in it, and generally for the better, or at least if towards that common goal that both are working towards. And I think that is an under-recognised and underappreciated benefit of partnership.
Yeah, I would agree. And just to add to that, I think what it also does is build, well, part of it is building respect and trust. And that doesn't happen quickly or over time, but it's building that trust and respect then allows people to let go a bit of their control, to step out into the center. But it doesn't move fast. And it's also much harder to measure in terms of accountability. It's very hard to quantify it. So, yeah, all those things.
Well, I mean, it's a really interesting conversation about how power sort of can sometimes be aligned with money, I suppose, within these funding environments. And Helen, I was reflecting on your comments about public sector organisations or governments funding and having those accountability measures with taxpayers, and having worked for private foundations, the same problems persist, I would say, and they persist for. I was reflecting then as you were speaking, because maybe some of the incentives for the ways in which people collaborate are a bit perverse and a bit kind of lopsided to be geared towards individual outcomes, I suppose, rather than collaborative ones. I'm talking about research space here. But I'm going to pick up on Nick's comment there around you have to give something up if you're going to be working in partnership. There's something that's got to give, and I'm interested, Nick, have you seen any good examples of where these collaborators or collaborations give something up in order to do anything good together?
I mean, that's a very good question. I think, I mean, to come up with not perhaps the most immediate apparent and not necessarily the best example, I do think that in the case of these product development partnerships, for example, the incorporation of sort of community voices or affected community inputs into their actual foundation changes the way in which they operate and sort of perhaps takes them away from where they might be more comfortable operating, changes the way in which they operate. I realize I'm talking in sort of generalities there a little bit because I don't have a precise neat illustration off the top of my head, but I think that is a pattern that I've seen.
Selena.
I was just going to take my hand down first. I was just going to say that make a comment on that things take time and trust and respect takes time. And then I was also going to give a quick example, not from my time at the Alliance, but from previous. I do think that trust takes time and partnership does too. And at the same time, not but, the opportunity of timing and the opportunity of ecosystems and networks within networks, the right networks to move together on something is perhaps one of the potential catalysts to speed up trust or speed up respect, if that makes sense at all. I mean, we can point to the involvement of the HIV/AIDS community and the treatment access to treatment in the early 2000s as one example, and there's multiple others. But with the current system in not just global health, but just in our current world system, power comes from resources, your platform, and your network. We don't always have all three, but some people are lucky, or some groups are very lucky, they have all three. But we can, without necessarily even a platform or without necessary resources as a network, are able to do more. And I think there is certainly a lot of potential, particularly in terms of timing, with the pandemic just still going through, but much more understanding of health in general, overall globally, but also in this country. And also with a new government, which I think, we are bipartisan, we work bipartisan, but just to play a nod to some of the speeches of the current foreign minister, which are not talking necessarily about global health, but talking about involvement of First Nations people in overseas policy, but also talking about partnership in a way that is not necessarily playing to the old narratives of how we used to hear geopolitics spoken about. And I think that's really welcome, and it's also very much in the values of global health. So in terms of the example, 20 years ago, I worked in China with Médecins Sans Frontières, and we were involved in setting up the first treatment centres for HIV/AIDS treatments in China. There was no such thing called civil society, and we worked with patient groups to set up the first memorandum of understanding between, sorry about the dog, between government and civil society. And I think that was really game-changing for the local provincial government at the time. They actually said that, and that network continued until now. And
dogs are always welcome on webinars. They're my favorite addition to the mix. But thank you, Selena. Yeah, there's something about I suppose inherently and naturally doing something that involves making sure the user's voice, the beneficiary or the participant, and we've even changed our language around that, which I think is a really nice example of progress within this space as well. I'm thinking back even just to my work in like patient public involvement. We don't even say that anymore, do we? But that way, there is an evolution of the ways in which people can collaborate, and those different voices can come into the mix. Anushka, I can see you.
Yeah, I was just going to expand on that a bit, Nick. I think that's true. I think there's much broader appreciation and from funders of any sort, a requirement for different terms they use: community engagement, involvement, PPI. But I think it'd be fair. I mean, this is a generalization, but in general, I think those community voices are still missing. Or are engaged with in a very superficial manner. I think there are many reasons for that, certainly in global health research or in health research generally. I mean, I think there's still many disciplines and many researchers who don't consider it important. There are, or that process of engaging with the end user doesn't necessarily align with the structural incentives around developing a professional career in research. There's limited understanding of how to do it or with whom to engage. And the funding time, I mean, we talked about time to develop trust and partnerships. It takes time. And the funding cycles and the timelines are just not conducive to not only allow genuine co-production of research, but also that sort of life cycle engagement that's necessary for true impact. So I think that there's a misalignment between the real desire to do this, but the context in which you can actually achieve that.
Absolutely. I was reflecting, a colleague yesterday said to me, introduced the term to me, which you may have heard, not consulted, but consultold, and these kind of groups of people who are brought in to be told exactly what to do next. And I thought it was a nice play on words, not a nice outcome, but yeah, certainly something that we see a lot of. Helen, you were going to say something. Yeah,
I hadn't heard that term, but I totally, people say, oh, but we consulted. Consulted means, yes, we actually called in a focus group, and so we've ticked that box. Yeah, but no, I was going to just briefly on the point Nick made about it changes organizations when you sit around the table, and changes not only the understanding, and I think it does, not always, but it should help break down that us and them dynamic too, because when you have everybody sitting around the table together, it's much harder for people to talk about them, because actually it's us around the table, and that just changes the dynamic of the discussion when you have these partnerships together. On a more negative note, when you said, have you seen things change? I was thinking we had at the beginning of the pandemic, extraordinary, and Anushka, you'd be more across this, extraordinary collaboration across, the pharmaceutical companies, the researchers, governments. It was just amazing. And my understanding is people were sharing, they were sharing as the information evolved, and that was great. And that's significantly dropped away. So you have, with pandemics, you have this panic, and then you go back down into neglect. So my understanding is, and I'm not particularly pointing the finger at them, but the big pharmaceutical companies are now step right back from that sharing and collaboration. So how do you maintain that sort of collaboration that comes when there's a crisis after the crisis is seen to have settled?
And I don't want to add negativity to the negativity, Helen, but I was reflecting on your conversations around funders, and I worked for a funder during the 2015-16 Ebola crisis, and what we were able to do was release funds very quickly to places that needed them, and release funds very quickly in collaboration with government agencies. But what is it, 7 years down the track, that those aren't systems and processes that are followed. And actually, as you described then in this current pandemic, those same problems persist because things hadn't changed in the background. So yeah, I think it's a really important point. Nick?
I was just going to say that this sort of comes to the nature of partnership and, what's just temporary collaboration and what's true partnership. But I think that the institutionalization of these partnership processes is one of the key things that we have learned, or the need for institutionalization and some sort of structure that transforms these partnerships of convenience or partnerships of panic in response to a global pandemic into true partnerships and lasting collaboration. And I think that that's something we haven't learned necessarily how to do, but I think there are examples and it's something we should definitely aim for.
And Helen, I was going to build on what you're saying as well, Nick. I was going to say, I think the next moment of panic is on us already. I think that might foster collaboration, although it's more chronic panic, and that is climate change. I think this is going to be a real opportunity as well as a challenge. You know, certainly is going to force us into unconventional partnerships. It's going to force us to think about our funding models. It's going to force us out of our silos. You know, from a sort of from the George Institute's perspective, I mean, we're certainly working with starting to work with partners that we would have never thought of working with even 2 or 3 years ago. But one interesting thing that I'm seeing certainly is that you know, particularly when you're thinking about the dual benefit mitigation agenda around climate change and health. We're seeing very similar debates and discussions around the decolonization discourse and climate justice. And it'll be really interesting and important for us to think about those together, I think, and not separately as we move forward.
Absolutely. I'm just aware there's a question in the chat. It's for Selena. I'm not sure whether you can see it, Selena, but I'll read it out to you. A little bit more about. Can you say a bit more about it's from Lottie, and Lottie's asking, can you say more about the work you're doing to integrate social issues and social sector perspectives into the work of the Alliance, and how different actors working on these issues and in these spaces can get involved in the Alliance's work?
Sure. I'll give the blunt answer and the less nuanced answer, and then give the more complex one and see if anyone else wants to jump in. So the direct answer is simply that it's an emerging area of work that we've only just begun formally and strategically to look at, seeing that there is a need and an interest. And it began specifically with the arts. And we, as I said, you know, we focused on the film festival this year, but with the advent of some new members that have joined the Alliance, particularly welcome Vic Health, for example, and other new members, other older members, such as the George and certain universities, who all, going into my complex answer now, work in global health on the determinants of health. I would argue that a lot of global health work already is working specifically with social sector, not necessarily in Australia, not all of them, but also outside. And I guess the challenge for our Alliance Secretariat and for the advisory board is to look at, you know, where is the added value of the Alliance in this area. We can certainly, you know, convene platforms and activities with members, but also we need to hear more and understand more, you know, what is of value and what is out there, because we don't know and need to listen. But I'm certainly a big proponent for the use of other modalities to promote global health messages, such as the arts, and I think it's a pretty much under-recognised use in terms of resources. But if you just look at any, just do a random PubMed search, you'll see that EMRO a couple of years ago did a review on the importance of outside health sector engagement, both for wellbeing, but also just to promote activities as well. So, messy answer. But my dog didn't bark, so it's good.
That's okay. Mine did. That's why I was standing up. I tried to wrestle a greyhound from a door. But thank you, Selena. I think the message that you're giving there is around it's all about the different voices that are going to be part of these conversations to progress anything. And so thinking about what actors and which actors and how they can participate. I think it's an open and ongoing dialogue, which is, I think, exciting for all of us working in the sector. I am aware of time and I'm always watching time because I'm a good host. I wanted to thank, firstly, my panelists for joining me today. Thank you so much for a really interesting conversation about partnerships and collaboration in this space. And thanks to everyone who's attended as well and a few questions. Lovely to see some familiar faces and some new ones too. Do stay in touch if you'd like to learn anything else about this series or some of the work we're doing, and on with your days. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.